Hello and welcome to Sensei podcast. This is Manos Brilakis discussing with leaders in the field of CTO and complex PCI. Sensei means teacher or master in Japanese. The goal of the Sensei podcast is to help you learn and improve in CTO and complex PCI so that you can become the best that you can be and offer your patients the best possible results. Hello and welcome to Sensei Podcast. It is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Yousif Ahmad from Yale University, where he directs the CTO and CIP program, and he's also the Associate Program Director for the Interventional Fellowship. Yousif has been a tremendous CTO operator, working on complex cases and a great friend for many years. So Yousif, thanks again for being with us this morning.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a real privilege to participate in this with you.
Thank you. So Yousif, tell us a little bit. I think you are originally from Lebanon, right?
My parents are actually from Iraq. So my parents are both from Iraq. They sort of left Iraq in the early to mid 80s. And they went to do sort of postgraduate medical training. They had kind of not decided whether they were going to settle in the UK or the US. And I ended up being born in the US. My mother had family here. And then after a couple of years, my dad had got work in the UK, so we all moved to England. I grew up in England from the age of 3. And so I did all of my education there, my, medical school, and postgraduate education was all done in England.
So it's interesting. So you have the perspective from both parts of the Atlantic, I guess, right? And what made you make the move back across the Atlantic?
So it's a good question. I had excellent training in London. I, trained at Imperial. I did my general cardiology, my interventional cardiology, and I did my PhD there. It was a very, exciting time to be at that department. It's where, they were inventing IFR. And so I was doing a lot of coronary physiology research. We were, my mentors were conducting the Orbiter trial. So it was a really sort of fertile area for clinical research, really, great mentors, great colleagues. But I found that when I had finished my interventional training and my PhD, I'd done a high volume of interventions, but I felt that, I wanted to expand my skill set and expand the number of, patients that I could treat. And, I was often seeing this, well-described phenomenon that the most complex, highest risk patients were often not receiving therapy. They're often too sick for bypass surgery. And then we would, have circular discussions about maybe the patient could have surgery, maybe not, and go back and forth. And the patients would kind of deteriorate and then not get treatment. So I felt that at the end of my training, although I felt comfortable and confident and was very, appreciative of the training I had, I just wanted to get additional skills. So I had decided to pursue extra fellowship training, and then, eventually decided, after some deliberation, to come to the US. So I moved across in 2019, and I did the CTO CHIP fellowship at Columbia with, Dimitri Kompaliotis, Jeff Moses, and Ajay Kirtani. That was, really a phenomenal year. It was a very unique place at the time. Excellent mentors, very high volume, outstanding training. Couldn't ask for better in terms of case complexity, case mix. My year was a little bit curtailed by COVID. And, that was also a unique experience being in New York City during that first wave of the pandemic. And then after finishing up there, I'd already done some structural training in England or some exposure. And so decided I wanted to do an extra structural fellowship. So I went to Cedars in Los Angeles. So I did a year doing structural training. But the real, highlight and sort of bonus part of that year is that I got to continue my sort of CTO CHIP training with Mike Wyman, who used to come, about once or twice a month, and Sahel Dohad. And so I almost felt like I got 2 CHIP fellowships, because I got to do the year at, Columbia with all the folks there. And then I got to do another year with, Sahel and Mike, and see different perspectives, different techniques. And it really, I think, helped my maturity as an operator, because I, got to consolidate everything I learned in my CHIP year in my second year at Cedars. And I think that really helped me when I, made that transition from fellowship to attending.
Wonderful. And, it's kind of unusual although there are a few people who do the same thing to have a combined training, are you still able to maintain both and be able to function in the structural and the coronary arena?
I think it's a really good and important point, to raise for discussion. And I think, a lot of it depends on your practice environment, and a lot of it depends on your sort of ambitions and aspirations. I would say that, since my main thrust of work now is CTO and complex PCI, and I get to still, do structural procedures and predominantly TAVRs and, contribute on that side. But, I think that mastery of everything in the modern age is more or less impossible. Everything is getting more complex. Patients are getting more complex. Techniques are getting more complex. And I think that, if you want to do everything, there ends up being a little compromise. I think you can't be a master of everything, particularly on the structural side. Now the things that are being done, mitral and tricuspid, and, now things like, electrosurgery. So, I don't claim to be a sort of expert on those sides. I think that maybe if I project my career forwards, 5 or 10 years, perhaps I won't be doing structural, but I'm fortunate enough to, practice in an environment where they're supportive of that. They know that I spent the extra year, learning and training. And, I'm able to sort of participate on structural but really focus on complex coronary is my sort of main sort of thrust.
Wonderful. And then how difficult was it for you, the transition? So going from a different medical environment, different techniques to some extent, to the US environment, was it a smooth transition? Was there a lot of adjustment? How easy was it to transfer the skills and the functioning in the different environment?
Yeah, so I would say, there were a couple of different adjustments I had to go through. I'd say, the core cath lab skills are obviously the same. Every cath lab is, as and every people listen, is slightly different. And because I've now gone through, several different cath labs, no matter how experienced you are and how many sort of cases you've done, the first couple of weeks, there is always a slight adjustment. The manifold is a little different. The TUI might be different. There are all these small things, you're not used to them. The staff, the fellows, the cadence of cases. I think that always takes a little bit of adjustment. In terms of larger scale adjustments, I had to get the first thing I had to get adjusted to was doing a different type of procedure. I think that we think of CTO and CHIP as an extension of coronary intervention, but it's really almost a completely different skill set. It's almost, I think we should consider it distinct the way we consider, endovascular and structural distinct. And so I had to, learn, new techniques, new equipment, new approaches. And the transition from the UK to the US, healthcare systems, did have some challenges. I would say that you're shielded to a lot of them when you're in training and in fellowship. You don't have to worry about any of the back-end issues or administrative issues. I'll tell you that work patterns are very different. In the National Health Service, out of hours or beyond like 5 o'clock, you really are only doing STEMIs. And so when I got to Columbia, I was a little bemused that it would be like 10 o'clock at night and we were doing right heart caths on, inpatients, with congestive heart failure. So that took a little bit of adjustment that, the blurring of, urgent and emergent work and the time that you do it is very different. As I said, in the National Health Service, it's very much, out of hours, it's just pure emergencies. Whereas over here, there's more of a, drive. You have to get the day's work done.
Wonderful. And then, I know it's the USMLE, all this pattern, right? How challenging was it for you? I mean, down the training, you're ready to practice, you have to take exams again, the basics. How tough was that? Many people I know have followed the same pathway, but.
Yeah, it was, it was difficult. I made a sort of vow to myself that after I took step 1, which is obviously the basic science component, that if I failed it, I wasn't going to take it again, and I was just going to come up with a new plan. I took the USMLEs and, did all of the paperwork and exams while I was doing my PhD. So I had a little bit more flexibility in my schedule. I think, people who are in full-time clinical positions, it's more challenging unless you can, take time off and protected time. But I just saw it as a, something that had to be done, like a means to an end. And, You buy the books and do the practice questions and kind of knuckle down, and then forget about it. If you pass and you can move on to the next stage, never go back to think about it again.
Wonderful. Well, tell us about your PhD. What was the topic, and how does it fit with what you are doing now?
Yeah, it was as I said, that research group at Imperial was it was a very exciting time to be there. We had a lot of expertise in coronary physiology. My direct supervisor for my PhD was Shai Sen, and he was an excellent supervisor and mentor to me. His mentor was Justin Davies, who's obviously very prominent in coronary physiology, and that was, as I said, the time when IFR had been invented, and so there was a lot of sort of excitement. My particular, PhD was focused on coronary physiology in patients with aortic stenosis, and so we were able to use the combo wire, which measures, not just pressure but flow, and then all of the other indices, resistance that you can get. And we took it in patients who had coronary lesions and severe aortic stenosis, and we would do a series of, pressure and flow measurements in various states, at rest and under hyperemia, before and after a transcatheter aortic valve replacement. So it ended up being a very, elegant study design, because the only thing changing between the measurements was the aortic stenosis was relieved. And in that way, each patient acts as their own control. There's no other sort of confounders, and you're able to really isolate the effect of aortic stenosis on coronary flow. I think that for people wanting to do clinical research and PhDs, you have to look at the group and the institution you're in and really try and harness the strengths of the department you're in. And the department I was in had a, high volume TAVR program, and also, had a lot of expertise in coronary physiology. And that was able to kind of, I was fortunate enough to have a project that was able to harness both of those strengths.
Wonderful. And actually curious, so what is the conclusion? Because I know there's a lot of debate still on the topic of the coronary lesions and aortic stenosis. Is the IFR better, I guess, or what was the conclusion?
I think that what we found is that the, diastolic resting ratios such as IFR don't change before and after TAVR. And so that makes intuitive sense, because, they're not relying on hyperemia. Patients with aortic stenosis can't always augment their flow in response to hyperemic stimuli. They're baseline vasodilated at rest. And also, you're not relying on the whole cardiac cycle. The opening of an aortic valve is a systolic phenomenon. In diastole, the aortic valve is closed, whether it's stenosed or not. So I think that if you isolate your measurements in diastole and at rest, we found that they were less likely to change. Now that doesn't mean that IFR is going to be superior in terms of clinical outcomes, etc. But it does mean that if you make a measurement with IFR, DFR, etc., in the presence of aortic stenosis, it's more likely to be the same if you repeat it again in a patient without aortic stenosis.
Perfect. And that's something, again, very relevant and practical to today's practice as well. Now, coming back to the complex cases. So you're at a big center, a lot of complexity around. How do you plan and trigger those and plan and prepare for those cases?
I think, like you and probably many of your guests, I love looking at angiograms and planning the procedures out. And so, I end up looking at each case multiple times. If it's a patient that I've seen in clinic, I end up preparing, my clinic every night before, looking at every single case. I often look at the images, with the patient, and then talk through, the different approaches we'll take. The night before a case, or CTO day, the night before, I will pull up all of the images again and look at them. And you're surprised, honestly, the amount of times you notice something different when you're going back to look at a film for a second or third time. And then the final time I'll look at it is with the fellow just before going into the room. And again, we'll look at the films together. I'll show them the way that I try and analyze the angiogram, and then we'll talk through the, strategy and options up front ahead of time. I then like to do we all, do timeouts, but I like to take the opportunity during the timeout to really brief the rest of the team and the staff on the anticipated steps, equipment, potential areas where, things might go wrong, what we might need. And then, I've found that since I've incorporated that into my practice, it's really, the whole team is then more dialed in. They're more invested in the procedure. You've told them about it beforehand. They know what to look out for. These are long cases, and often, although the complexity is high, and we know that the risk is high, unless you've briefed the team, these can be cases where people are more likely to sort of switch off and sort of disengage because they're long, and there might be, large portions of the case where nothing's happening. But, as we all know, things can change very, very quickly. So I've found that taking the time, during that, surgical timeout or pause or whatever, workflow you have in your institution, taking that, opportunity to, have the same type of conversation that you're having with your fellow, have it with the rest of the team. Make sure people know their tasks, what you're going to rely on them for: ACTs, sedation, pulling equipment, emergency salvage, what's the bailout if things go wrong. So I've found, incorporating that into my practice, I think has really, helped bring the team along and improve our outcomes.
And then, do you get stressed out during those cases? You get anxious or you feel calm? How does this evolve for you?
I think that before the cases, I tend not to be, anxious. Before the cases, I'm pretty calm. I normally have an idea of what I want to do. And I normally have an idea of, first, second, or third steps. I would say that in every case, there are a couple of inflection points where you kind of have to decide, what the next step is going to be. And I find in those moments where I'm deciding, is it time to go retrograde, or is it time to dissect, etc.? I don't feel nervous, but I feel like my, thought processes kick up a gear. I find that the first, portion of a case is almost on autopilot. The equipment has been planned, the approaches have been planned. But as you get to that inflection point, I often, pause, talk out loud, talk through the options. And I would say that in every, particularly in CTOs, there's a moment when you sort of have your, heart in your mouth slightly, when you know that you're doing something where the risk is going up slightly. When you're doing something and, the risk is something that is, you feel fairly is in control and predictable, I feel very calm. When the risk goes, when you know that the hazard is going up, when you're about to go through a, epicardial, where you're taking very, very sort of stiff wires, etc., then I always have a very healthy amount of fear, and I find my, vigilance level is, popped up. I have more adrenaline. I'm looking at everything. I might be looking at the pressure, every 2 seconds instead of, intermittently. And then obviously, if there is a complication, I think everyone has that, sinking feeling in the pit of their stomach if they see a perforation, etc. And I think, we have to harness that and not let it escalate and overtake us so that we can't manage the situation. So I think, I have a healthy amount of fear before every case, but I would say without sort of nerves or anxiety. And my psychological state, fluctuates depending on, the point in the case I am.
Wonderful. And are there any cases that stick to your memory that have taught you a lot?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of cases have, stuck in my memory that have taught me a lot. But I think particularly those of us who have done dedicated sort of chip fellowships, I think your experience is slightly different, because I think that if the first time I went retrograde or the first time I did a stingray was as an attending, it would kind of stick out in my mind more and kind of be more of a, highlight, defining case. But I think when you spend a year doing these things, it's a little bit different, because the way I was taught by Dimitri, Jeff, Ajay, and others is you build up the cases incrementally, and so instead of it being a wow moment at the end, over the course of a year you've learned certain skill sets. And as you progress through the year, you can sort of combine the skill sets together, and then all of a sudden, kind of without you noticing it, you realize that you're competent to go retrograde. So I would say that my memorable cases, I think the individual cases that stick out more are all sort of since I graduated, but the cases that taught me the most were during fellowship. And it was really, as I said, rather than like one highlight reel case, it was being able to build up these building blocks of skill sets, and then all of a sudden you find you can put them all together.
Wonderful. What was the thing that was the most difficult to learn and to teach?
Probably different between learning and teaching. I would say the most difficult thing to teach is wire manipulation, or because we don't have a chip fellowship, so I'm teaching our interventional fellows, and as we all know, fellows are very enthusiastic and want to be at the front of the case, and we want them to as much as possible. But you have to understand, what is the risk involved versus what is the experience level of the trainee. And certainly in the first half of their years, we can't necessarily have them handling, all of the CTO wires. But I find that even, we've had very, very good trainees over the last couple of years. And in the second half of their year, they are, in position one for crossing and doing all of that. But I find that articulating the movements with the wire is very, very challenging. A lot of it for us, as you get a bank of volume and experience, is sort of muscle memory, and they are almost imperceptible movements. You feel something is not quite right, and you adjust it slightly, and you cross, and you know in your mind what you did, but it's very difficult, at least for me, to sort of articulate, verbalize, and explicitly say, what were the three slight movements I did. Um, and so I've found the hardest thing to sort of teach is, wire manipulation. I think the thing that took me the longest to learn in my chip fellowship, then I think Dimitri would get very frustrated with me with how long it took me to learn, was in challenging to cross lesions talking the microcatheter. It took me, probably longer than it should have to master the movement of sort of pinning the wire with your sort of pinky and then talking and being able to get through the lesion with the microcatheter. I would say that's the thing that took me the longest to learn.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think actually many people are always very concerned. I think turning aggressive microcatheter does take time and experience. So I don't think you're alone in that part. Now, in terms of the trainees, as you mentioned, you train interventional fellows right now. What are the things that you look for when you recruit them or during the year? What are the qualities or the attitudes that make you excited to teach them intervention and regular and complex?
Yeah, I think that to be a successful interventional cardiologist and to sort of maximize the most from your fellowship, there is a certain baseline level of skill that's required, but it is, much less important than people think. I would say that there are, at either end of the spectrum, maybe 1 to 2% of people who are extraordinarily gifted with their hand skills, 1 to 2% who struggle particularly, and nearly everybody else is in the middle and will get there with enough time. And people take different amounts of time to get to the required standard. So I would say that hand skills are not something that I focus on particularly. I think someone, particularly for complex intervention, there are certain personality traits that are required. Now, I don't like the idea that doing CTO or complex PCI, you need to be aggressive or gung-ho. But I think that if you are extraordinarily cautious, that it's probably not the right, field for you. Equally, you have to have a certain amount of resilience and grit and resolve. I will tell you that by far, I have the highest failure rate of any operator in my lab. And so I don't think that makes me the worst operator, but you have to be comfortable with failure if you're going to do CTOs, and you have to be willing to learn from them. If your personality type is such that, you find failure, a crushing blow, so much so that you can't even learn from it because you find it such a, an unpleasant experience to go through, then again, maybe doing, CTOs and complex PCI isn't for you. So I think that there are certain character traits, a willingness to learn new things, a willingness to fail, and then not to be the most cautious person in terms of your, personality trait, in terms of, the type of cases you're willing to do. I think that if someone is, has a healthy amount of, fear of, consequences, that's important, and that's appropriate. But I think that if you're on the very cautious end of the spectrum, then it's probably not for you. So really, more than, hand skills, as I said, I, look at personality traits. All of our fellows honestly are very diligent, hardworking, enthusiastic, and want to learn. I think those are kind of the, minimum bar that everyone, meets. They don't get to be at the stage they are at without having those, qualities. But I look at, certain personality traits to, identify, who might do best in the realm of, CTO and complex PCI.
Wonderful. So, how about yourself? How do you keep fit to do the offers demanding work? Do you exercise? Do you do other things to keep you in good shape?
No, I mean, I wish I did. I'm currently on a diet because I didn't weigh myself for about a year. That I, weighed myself and found I'd put on some weight. The main things that I do, sort of, outside of work to try and clear my mind, is honestly spend time with my family, be able to sort of decompress. I think that in the beginning, the first few months out of fellowship as an attending, I found it very, very difficult to segment my work life from my home life. And I found that led to sort of, a snowballing of my stress levels because I was at home. There was nothing I could do. The outcome was the outcome, or the, complication had occurred. But I was really perseverating on it and, talking it over with my wife, and then going over back with my head and speaking to colleagues. And, I think, you know, peer review with your colleagues is important, but I think that equally important is having, a healthy distinction between your work life and your non-work life. And I think that if you don't have that distinction, you can carry a lot of weight and stress around with you, psychologically, almost imperceptibly. It affects the way you sleep. It affects, your happiness levels. So I think that, having done it for a little longer, what I've learned to be able to do is have an easier distinction between what happens at home and, what happens at work.
So, how do you separate the two right now? Do you say when you walk through the door, that's it, and your page are offering you're done? How do you kind
Yeah, I
of
mean, I wish
change?
the page could be. I mean, my phone is always on. All of my colleagues and, patients will tell you that, my phone is always on and it's always on loud. And in fact, I tell the residents and fellows that I want to be called if anything happens to my patients out of hours. I don't want to find out about it in the morning. But what I've really started to do over the last year or so is that I give myself a time limit. And so, if I get home, I might debrief, with my wife, for up to 30 to 60 minutes. And then after that, there's no more talk about the day, no more talk about cases, no more talk about work. And I really I've started to give myself a time limit for how long will allow myself to kind of dwell on things. And after that time limit is up, then, psychologically, I know that I've filed it kind of in the past, and then, we're going to move on to other things.
Wonderful. And then, do you have any favorite books or any favorite movie?
Um, I mean, my favorite medical book would be your CTO manual. I remember when we were
Oh,
when I was in fellowship, Dimitri bought, us copies of that, and that was the first thing he told us to do. He was like, read this, cover to cover, and then halfway through the year, read it again, and then at the end of the year, read it again. My favorite non-medical book is probably a novel called The Remains of the Day by Ishiguro. I think it was in the early 90s or late 80s, about an English butler who was in a stately home sort of before World War II. The novel is set, after, and he reminisces back and, his on his experiences. And it has a lot of themes of sort of, you know, Englishness, dignity. The narrator is an unreliable narrator, and a lot of, you know, ruminations on sort of the passing of time. And so that's a novel that I've read, several times over the years. My favorite movie has actually probably some of the similar themes. It's called Once Upon a Time in America. It's a gangster movie by Sergio Leone, but it's actually set in New York following a group of young Jewish children from their childhood when they're sort of friends. Then they sort of get older and they start to get into, capers, and then they get older still and they become sort of New York City mobsters. And again, there's a lot of themes of sort of loss, betrayal, friendship, passage of time. The movie takes place in several different eras and kind of flips back and forth between them. And that's a movie that, again, I've returned to several times over the years.
so in terms of your the clinical work and the research work, are you able to keep up some of the research you were doing before? Do you do some other things? What is the role of research right now in your practice?
Yeah, I mean, I try to keep as, clinical research is very important to me. It's one of the reasons I wanted to work in academic medicine. I try and keep up as much as I can, my productivity with writing and publishing, but it's difficult. I would say that, nominally I have 20% protected academic time, but in your first, few years, you're all focusing on, building a practice. If you're doing, a high volume of complex interventions, that takes a lot of time. And it's not just time in the cath lab, it's time afterwards, getting patients sort of, through after their hospital care. It's building a referral base, having a good relationship, having, relationships in the institution. So I would say that in my first couple of years, I probably tilted more towards clinical, and you try and, as your career changes, to change the balance. And so yeah, clinical research is important to me. um, it's difficult, I'd say, in a very, very busy clinical environment when you're trying to build a program. The main interest I have, moving forward, is clinical trials and trying to sort of get access to new therapies and new devices and evaluate them in the most sort of appropriate, rigorous, bias resistant methods. And fortunately, I'm at a place that sort of allows us to do that.
And what are you most excited about for the future?
What I am excited about is the potential for changing some of the proctoring educational models. I think it's probably increasingly difficult to have, for everybody to have access to sort of proctors and experts and people to take time out to visit people's labs. I think it's our excellent, experience when it's available. But I've seen that, some of the companies are coming out or trying to develop technologies that allow for virtual proctoring, either live or also, there are some technologies that I think have been pioneered in the OR, where everything that happens in the room is recorded, and then that recording gets compressed down to a video, and then you can share it with your colleagues. And then I think that's so valuable. And if we can harness something like that in interventional cardiology, you can record the entire procedure, and then you can share it with your colleagues and say, what do you think? Because all of us, honestly, our memories are not perfect, and our descriptions aren't perfect. And you try and get communicate as much of a sense of what happens, but it can't replicate seeing what happened. And I think physically being there is increasingly difficult these days. But I think if there are models and methods to sort of open up virtual proctorship, as I said, either live via some type of video links, or to record the whole contents of a case and compress it down in a way that it's shareable, I think that would be such a amazing avenue for people to learn and develop and hone their skills.
Perfect. And there's a lot of things going on right now with all the systems, as you say. So hopefully we'll see more of that coming down the line. How about the things that you are proud of? What are you most proud of so far?
I'm proud of having been able to, grow and build a program at Yale. It's something that I've been able to do due to support of colleagues. But I'm proud of being able to have done a reasonable volume of these cases over the last few years, with a good safety record and good outcomes. I think that there is always, particularly with CTO, there is always a nagging doubt in the back of your mind as you transition from fellow to attending as to whether you can do the cases. There is, doing the case with, a world renowned expert next to you is one thing, but being able to sort of transition out and put it all together and do it independently, there is always some, or at least for me, there is some doubt. And I think that, realizing that I was able to do it over the first few months was immensely satisfying to me. And then being able to sort of take that and run with it and help to sort of develop a program which has had, good outcomes and, good safety profile, good success rates, and increasing, support and endorsement from the sort of wider community at my institution is something that I've been very, very proud of.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, as you know, also academic centers can be harder sometimes to build those CTO and complex programs, for many reasons, including, the culture and the referrals and a lot of other things. So again, congratulations on building that over at Yale and making a tremendous program.
Thank you very
And I
much.
always ask people, so what is your advice? If you had to pick the top things for someone to become successful like yourself, what would you advise them to do?
I would say that it depends on the point in their career they are in. I would say I was fortunate. At the time that I decided to undertake all of these fellowships, I was single at the time. I was able to move from sort of London to New York to Los Angeles in 3 consecutive years. And I was able to take decisions that were purely for the benefit of my training and education. And so I don't, for 1 minute think that's applicable to everybody. You may have family commitments. You don't want to move your family. You may have financial, commitments that you can't, extend your training. I would say that if you are in a position like I was, try and find the absolute best training, environment for you. And then take that opportunity, because as life goes on, you have less flexibility and less opportunity to go back and do those things. So for the people that are earlier in their career, that are maybe completing interventional fellowships, that have real interest in CTO and complex PCI, I do, I'm biased because I did a CHIP fellowship, but I do still think that no way to replace the sort of intense training and volume of cases you get to do than in a dedicated fellowship. I think more broadly and more applicable to people at various stages of their careers, to have a high level of curiosity. When I first was trying to learn about CTOs, it was a completely different language. I didn't understand what was going on. I didn't know what the different terms meant. But I think if you're curious, the resources are available. One thing that I did a lot in my training is watch the humongous amount of recorded cases and live cases. My wife used to make fun of me that, if she went out, my sort of evening's entertainment would be to, put on a live case and watch it start to finish. But I think that there's such value in watching people work through the challenges. I think one of the things that I love about CTO Plus is that you see the whole case, start to finish. You have a lot of time for the live cases. So you get to see these, expert operators, get stalled at certain points of the procedure, troubleshoot them. And so I would say that, live cases and recorded cases are, huge sources of, valuable learning, and that I would, really tap into those, because those, with the amount of things that are available online now, you're not restricted in terms of travel and cost and things like that. And I would say to the people that are transitioning from fellowship to practice, that are trying to build practice, I would just say be aware of the environment that you're stepping into, and don't be too many standard deviations away from what is currently being done at the beginning. Now, that doesn't mean that if you're going into an environment that is conservative, that you should be uber conservative and not do any cases. But I would say that if you want to change culture, and change practice patterns, it's much more effective to do that in an incremental, gradual way, rather than starting at one end of the extreme, and trying to show people like this is what can be done, and everybody else doesn't know what's going on. I would say don't be more than 1 or 2 standard deviations away, and then just incrementally implement things that will help lead to sort of effectual change.
Yeah, absolutely. That's very important, as you said, for CTOs and complex, because the complication risk is higher. So it only takes 2-3 consecutive complications at the beginning to literally kill a program on its origin. So taking it slowly, as you say, and carefully. I mean, control everything, but whatever you can would play a great role in the success.
Yeah, I completely agree. That I know that some people disagree with that type of philosophy, but I do think that the best way to build a program is really organically and through having good outcomes. And the easiest way to sort of kill a program, as you said, is to have complications are inevitable, but we can't control people's reactions to them, and so that if you have a string of complications early on, it can be damaging and hard to recover from. I think if people see that you're trying to do things in a righteous, reasonable way, that you've had full discussions with people, they're more understanding of them. But yeah, I am a believer in sort of doing things incrementally and organically, rather than trying to do radical shifts.
Absolutely. Well, Ahmed, again, thank you so much. It was tremendous, talking to you today. Congratulations on building a great program at Yale, and looking forward to keep on working with you.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me again. That was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening to the Sensei podcast.